Hi everyone, today we're going to critically deal with the moral question of whether or not we should separate the art from the artist. One of my favorite artists of all time is the legendary musician, performer and Oscar-winning actor Frank Sinatra, namely because of his astonishing vocal abilities and his priceless contributions to the music industry. However, I recently discovered the darker side, so to say, of his career. Sinatra supposedly had several mob ties throughout his career that he used for his advantage, like receiving a role for movies or hiding his abusive behavior towards his wife, Ava Gardner, from the public. When I found out about these allegations made against him, I was conflicted for a long time, as I knew I would never look at the songs he dedicated to his wife or his iconic roles in classic movies the same way again, so I did not consume his art for long. But was that the right thing for me to do? Could I have separated his professional work from his personal life? Should I have? Even though this problem seems relatively recent, the question whether or not an artist's oeuvre should be judged based on his persona is a century-old dilemma in our society. In the 70s, we were questioning whether or not to censor the Rolling Stones because of their heavy drug abuse during their concerts. In the 60s, whether or not an artist should be allowed to declare themselves openly communist. Even Socrates was killed due to the belief he was a threat and bad influence for his younger audiences more than 2,000 years ago. This debate has been popularized in the last decades because of how easy and fast it is to access information on the internet. I mean, Picasso was discovered to be a terrible and misogynistic human being practically when he was dead, but nowadays we can judge an artist's behavior in real time when they tweet things like these. Even though now there are more weapons than ever to blame the artists, the question remains the same. Should we separate the art from the artist? Well, in order to understand what it really means to make this distinction, let's look at a period of time in recent history where art was not dependent on the people who created it, and that is the rise and fall of the avant-garde artistic movements, such as Cubism, Expressionism, and Surrealism at the end and beginning of the 19th and 20th centuries. The purpose of art at the time did not go beyond the formal features of the work. It was art for art's sake, and art pieces were meant to be appreciated solely based on formal aspects and their aesthetic response of their consumer, not on the context in which they were created. Now, this does obviously not apply for every piece of art ever created. It is different when a piece of art is meant to be understood, having its historical and cultural context in mind. Take Goya's The 3rd of May 1808. A depiction of the mass murder of Spanish civilians by the hands of the French at the beginning of the War of Independence. It is for many considered as a powerful anti-war statement, that is, if you ask me, morally good. And just as this piece has a morally positive intention, it is logical to assume that art can be morally bad too, like the people who create it. This drawing by Balthasar Klosowski called Therese Dreaming depicts an 11-year-old girl in her underwear, which outraged and disgusted many viewers, that described it as a romanticization of the sexualization of a child, and even signed petitions to have it removed from New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. The moral values of this piece are negative according to the audience, but does that make it aesthetically worse? Is this a bad piece after all? Well, let's look at another example to answer this. Robin Thicke's Blurred Lines is one of the most popular yet controversial hit songs of the 2010s, mainly because of its lyrical content, as it trivializes sexual violence and clearly objectifies women. Here are some of the best examples for lines of that song that allude to that. Even though this song has a terrible take on consent, does that prevent it from being a banger? How do we deal with this issue? How do we reconcile aesthetic and ethical criticism of art? Well, one way to face this could be looking at what the work asks of us, the way it is supposed to make us feel. Was Therese Dreaming really a romanticization of child pornography or an innocent depiction of an 11-year-old? Either way, I am disgusted by it, which leads me to think that the morality of the content is another feature of the artwork, equally as important as others, that makes it better or worse. Moral flaws in art can influence our aesthetic perception, even more so if the context in which the artwork was created is questionable, which makes us go back to the importance of an artwork's historical context. Take the 90s hit song Age Ain't Nothing But a Number by one of my favorite singers, Aaliyah. The lyrics are about dating someone older. The problem is that they were written by her then husband, the 27-year-old R. Kelly, when Aaliyah was 15, a man that since then has been accused and arrested for like 100 sex crimes. The question is, when this song pops up on the radio, what do? Do you enjoy the song despite its ethically questionable context of creation, or does this reminder prevent you from wanting to hear it? Both options are possible. Therefore, moral and aesthetic aren't necessarily connected, but depending on our own knowledge and experiences, they can be. The reading of an artwork may or may not be influenced by the information we have or don't have about it, sometimes voluntarily. Let's say you're reading articles or books about a certain artist or exhibition, or sometimes involuntarily. You're told by others or you happen to find about it in your feed. And this works both ways. The information you have about the artwork can also have a positive impact on your reading of it. Let's say you watch an artist's interviews or posts and find out that they're an activist. And now, being aware that the moral and aesthetic values of art can be correlated and influence each other, it is logical to ask where the need to connect the art, case in point, the person with the artwork, comes, if it is the artwork's moral values that we're criticizing. And the answer to this question is relatively simple. We, as humans, reserve moral criticism for people, not objects. Who's guilty of a murder? The murderer who killed the victim, or the knife used to kill them? Still, this does not make art morally neutral anyway, as artworks mostly pretend to influence or cause certain emotions on the audience anyways. Another example for this would be the movie Triumph of the Will, considered a cinematographic masterpiece despite being a Nazi propaganda film, created to spread hideous and violent worldviews. And now, having understood why we relate the moral flaws of art with the artist, we still have to understand the reason we ask ourselves this question in the first place. To make this simple, we can narrow the answer down to two statements. One, they are famous, and two, they are role models for society. And it is with this last statement that we can start another discussion. Should an artist be a role model for society? Well, an artist's job is to record music, give concerts, entertain, etc. The fact society has made them famous and therefore attributed them a moralizing role does not necessarily mean they have to bear that responsibility. And now we have found the actual problem. Society looks for moral reference in people who are not, and that is not the artist's fault. Actors, singers, football players, celebrities have their own social values, just like you or me, and they should not be different from yours or mine just because of their fame. And that is exactly why there will always be people incapable of separating the art from the artist. They will not accept that bad people can create good art. Therefore, they will need their favorite artists to be innocent to consume their artwork, and will defend them to death, even disparaging their victims. Take the case of Roman Polanski, one of the greatest Polish filmmakers that was declared guilty of rape of a 13-year-old girl in 1979, fled to France before he was sentenced, and was finally arrested in Switzerland nearly 40 years after. More than 100 celebrities and countless cinephiles signed a petition to get him out of jail. And just as there are people who will never be able to separate the art from the artist, there should be people able to tell the difference, right? Well, yes, if you look at the relationship between the art and the artist, not dissimilar to the one of a vendor and their wares. Why do you buy Jordans? Do you like the sneakers, or do you support Nike's child labor policies when it comes to their fabrication? Well, you clearly don't, hopefully, because consumption is mostly impersonal. Consumers don't usually contemplate the morality of the products they consume, just as for many, that may find the artist to be just a few letters below the song's title they are listening to. But is this stance really realistic? Is it really possible for the art to exist in a vacuum, not affected by the morality of its content, the context of its creation and its artist? Absolutely not. Artworks are way more than their formal features. They're created within historical events, by people with different backgrounds, and it's almost impossible not to have these parameters built into them. Take Alan Jones' hat stand, table and chair sculptures from 1956. They are for many an obvious depiction of Jones' misogyny and objectification of women. But what if the same sculptures were created by a feminist in the 21st century? That would lead to different interpretations and reactions from the public. Do you see where I'm going with this? And separating the art from the artist is even harder when their art reflects their terrible behavior or their hideous crimes. Some artworks in Picasso's oeuvre may allude in some way or another to his hatred towards women, but in the case of Paul Gauguin, things couldn't be more obvious. He's known to have married 3 minor Tahitian girls, have had children with them, and have abandoned the families and infected the girls with syphilis. And guess what? His oeuvre shows mostly what? Tahitian girls. Things like these make the artworks obviously immoral, and are praise ethically questionable, as the audience feels as if they were taking part in the artist's redemption by consuming his work. From this point of departure, we have two possible things to do. We either convince ourselves of their innocence, which in the case of Michael Jackson, for example, might be an easy thing to do. He was accused of child molestation a few times throughout his lifetime, but declared innocent of all accusations. In 2019, he was accused once more by two men, who even published a documentary narrating their story of abuse. In this case, it is the testimony of two men against dozens of FBI files that prove Michael's innocence. But in cases like the one of R. Kelly, that has been accused and arrested for life, it is much more complicated to excuse him if even possible. The other thing we could do is convince ourselves that we are not supporting them by enjoying their art. But is this really true? Do we really become complicit in an artist's immorality by, for example, spending money on their artwork? Well, first of all, the cancellation of an artist doesn't always have an impact on their audience or career. The rapper Chris Brown assaulted Rihanna in 2009, pleaded guilty and had to perform community service. He had continued releasing music with a moderate success and has even won several awards ever since. But even though they might not be affected, the question whether or not to give monetary support to immoral artists is still important. Do we become complicit, yes or no? Well, my answer is no, not really. Mainly because there are artists not affected by our money, dead ones and imprisoned ones for life. But does that mean an artist's oeuvre suddenly becomes morally neutral once they are dead? Also not, which is why involving money in the issue is not really a good idea if you ask me. Money aside, it totally makes sense to think twice when consuming art of an immoral artist. A nice way to look at this issue is to put yourself in the artist's skin. What if I do the same thing an artist was cancelled for? What is my social responsibility when I mess up? In order to answer these questions, let's take a different approach. It is true that there are certain groups that we, as a society, should judge morally in regards to their professions. Policemen. If they commit illegalities and are immorally reprehensible people, then how are they supposed to straighten out the crime? Same for politicians, or at least supposedly the same. With that out of the way, as for a personal level, should our personal life interfere with our professional one? Should you be fired from your job when you're caught driving drunk on a Saturday after a party? Obviously not. So why shouldn't it be the same for artists? Why should they be irredeemable? Well, spoiler, they are usually not. Cancel culture usually manifests as a temporary loss of income for the artist. In the case of Michael Jackson, after the release of Leaving Neverland, the documentary I was talking about before, his streams went down considerably, and he was dropped by many radio stations. Yet the damage of the documentary has vanished ever since, and Michael's legacy has successfully recovered, as his streams and listeners are back to his usual amounts. These temporary timeouts seem to be a sufficient penance, even if the artist doesn't publicly apologize for their acts, which in the case of Michael was impossible. But going back to Chris Brown, he did not publicly acknowledge the assault and apologize for it until 10 years had passed. And this is exactly the point where cancel culture logically falls apart. Because what we seek when consuming art with moral requirements should not be a temporary penance, but an apology and a lesson to learn from the artist in question. Take the case of James Gunn, the director of movies like Guardians of the Galaxy or Suicide Squad, who tweeted distasteful jokes regarding pedophilia and sexual assaults, and was therefore fired from Marvel in 2018. He publicly apologized and was given back his job after showing remorsement. Does an apology mean that artists should not suffer the consequences for their crimes? No, but they should, just like you and me. The fact that they are famous should not have to do anything with that. It is ironic for us to scandalize artists who commit crimes and face the legal consequences for their acts, but not the artists who commit crimes and don't because they are famous. There are artists who commit tax evasions or suborn their victims and get away with it because of their fame, and that is exactly what should scandalize society. These public reactions have shown that we try to have an objective approach on the issue, as we pretend to draw the line between morally acceptable and unacceptable art. But the truth is that things are not always as easy as they seem. Problems like these require individual approach, perspectives and experiences. There might be a case where you're totally comfortable looking at a piece of art a friend of yours can't bear. Therefore, there isn't really a correct or precise answer to the dilemma. And so what do? It's up to us. But purging museums and art history books of any artist that has done something morally questionable isn't really an option. Some museums have decided to mention damaging information to the artists for their audience to take into consideration. But what you can do when facing the scenarios I have mentioned is to keep in mind several questions that will help you decide what to do. Is the work a collaborative effort where the damaging artist is just one person out of the many? Does the work remind you of the offense or even promote it? Who suffers when you consume their artwork? And as for a personal opinion, I always try to keep these things in mind when judging an artwork's morality based on its artist. And in my case, you will not find me listening to R. Kelly's music, but I will keep appreciating Frank Sinatra's timeless contributions to the music industry.